A new study seems to confirm that China's much-hyped Belt and Road Initiative has met with major failures. A report by researchers from Harvard University and the World Bank finds that China has spent a colossal $185 billion in just 5 years, providing financial bailouts to debt-ridden countries who signed up to China's Belt and Road Initiative. This report seems to confirm fears that China's BRI has pushed poor countries to take on unsustainable levels of debt. To begin with, it helps to briefly understand what China's Belt and Road Initiative set out to do. Starting in the 1980s, China's economy boomed and expanded quickly. Chinese firms, especially in fields like construction, had grown tremendously during the nation's 3-decade economic boom. As the country's economic growth began to slow though in the 21st century, these companies faced a problem. They were having trouble finding customers. If China was to continue its breakneck growth and become a global economic power, it would need to look outside its borders for markets. That was when China's new president, Xi Jinping, unveiled the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, in 2013. It had a few key steps. Step 1. China poured billions of dollars into developing countries to build out crucial infrastructure and development projects. Developing nations had become fed up with Western countries and institutions like the World Bank. These institutions needed feasibility studies, background checks, anti-corruption measures, environmental protections, and the like before they lended money to developing countries. China, on the other hand, financed a number of risky mega projects in poor developing nations that traditional lenders would avoid precisely because they were not considered to be viable. Step 2. Once countries accepted the money and began to work on projects, they found that much of the building work actually went to Chinese enterprises. Developing countries would build infrastructure on loans that China gave them, hand lucrative contracts to Chinese firms, and were expected to pay back the money at high interest rates to China. Step 3. With this Chinese-funded infrastructure built, there would be a major expected economic boom in Asia, Africa, and Europe, and Beijing would have successfully built itself into every global supply chain that would matter. However, a new report by researchers from Harvard University and the World Bank finds that China's grand plans have run into trouble. Instead of benefiting from the Belt and Road Initiative, China spent an estimated $185 billion in 5 years between 2016 and 2021, bailing out developing countries that signed up to the BRI. Researchers found that China largely gave bailouts to countries that were already heavily indebted to China. A common characteristic of the recipient countries of Chinese rescue lending is that they have borrowed extensively from Chinese banks during the lending boom of the 2010s. So what went wrong with the BRI? It seems that China's selection of risky, politically motivated projects was deeply flawed. A case in point is the Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka. After both India and the United States declined to fund the project because they thought it was an economic dud, the Chinese swooped in to fund it. Sri Lankan authorities themselves were dubious about the port's unsustainability. After all, Sri Lanka's Colombo port handled the vast majority of the country's maritime trade. However, the port was located in then-President Mahinda Rajapaksa's home constituency, which meant that political considerations trumped economic and business ones. This was a problem that continued to haunt the BRI as China funded risky, politically motivated projects in poor developing countries, which had little hope of paying back the vast sums of money that they had borrowed from Beijing. Pakistan, Laos, Mongolia, Kyrgyzstan, Djibouti, Montenegro, Tajikistan, and Maldives are just some examples of countries that have seen debt skyrocket because of easy Chinese lending. 42 countries now have Chinese debt that exceeds 10% of GDP. Over the last few years, a number of high-profile failures across the world and widespread allegations of corruption began to hurt the Belt and Road Initiative's brand. The BRI's failure seems to have been confirmed by how countries have reacted to its now toxic brand. Nepal, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Maldives, Uganda, and South Africa, among others, have backed away from the BRI. China too seems to have acknowledged that the game is up. In just 1 year between 2019 and 2020, Beijing's BRI investment dropped a staggering 54% to its lowest ever level since the initiative started. In Africa, home to 40 BRI nations, Chinese bank financing for infrastructure projects fell from $11 billion in 2017 to $3.3 billion in 2020. The focus is now on smaller, more sustainable projects rather than the grand ambitions President Xi Jinping started out with in 2013. However, even as China calls curtains on the BRI, the vast debts accrued by poorer developing nations remain an unsolved crisis for the global economy.